Thanks for that introduction, Pete. And thanks also to the Food Packaging Forum for, I'll just go one back, for inviting me to come here today to speak about consumer views on food packaging. My disclaimer up front is that I will not be talking about new science. I will not even be talking about traditional science, although there are those that claim that politics is also a science. But before jumping in, just a brief word on who we are. BEUC is the European Consumer Organization. We act as the umbrella organization for our 43 members in 32 European countries. Our members are national, independent, and well-respected consumer organizations. And our task as BEUC in Brussels is to represent them towards the EU institutions and to defend the interests of all European consumers. So, food and food packaging safety is a traditional priority for the consumer movement and for consumers across Europe, of course. Unfortunately, we have a situation today where, or not unfortunately, fortunately we have a situation today where the current EU system of food packaging regulation aims to safeguard the safety and interests of consumers. Here's the unfortunate part. Neither of those objectives are adequately achieved today. And to illustrate that statement, I want to briefly share with you two examples from our members' work. First of all, a test on fluorinated compounds performed by 5 of our members last year that found high levels of fluorinated compounds, PFAS, in 1/3 of fast food packaging samples, so paper and board food packaging. These compounds, PFAS, are known to bioaccumulate, and scientists also suspect that they play a role in causing cancer, infertility, and obesity. Fluorinated compounds have been shown to migrate migrate from food packaging and into the food, depending on temperature, duration, food composition, and so on. Scientists have called for limits to the production and use of PFAS, including a statement last year in Zurich, I think. But still, the results that our members found indicate that these compounds are being used intentionally in food packaging. And basically, there is no system, no regulation in place governing how these compounds are used in food packaging. Perhaps the most interesting finding from this study was, however, that across the 5 countries and across the tested products and material groups, these PFAS chemicals were found in some, but not in all of the sample products. So at least the study demonstrates that alternatives do exist. Moving on to a very recent test from Norway, which goes along some of the lines we heard earlier today on plastics. Our member tested reusable plastics water bottles and found that phthalates, bisphenols, flame retardants, and leads were leaching into the content of the bottles. Disturbingly, it seems bottles marketed to kids were the worst performers in the test. Fortunately, none of the examined bottles give rise to a health hazard seen in isolation. But taken together with all other products that we are surrounded with in our daily life, they do contribute towards a total exposure to chemicals that is worrisome. Again, the test found a wide variation in the levels of detected substances. And this shows that there's significant potential for some manufacturers, at least, to improve their record, especially those that market products to children. So are consumers concerned by this? Yes, they are. Last year, 4 in 5 Europeans reported concerns about their exposure to chemicals in products, and this number is up from 43% in 2014. These concerns were expressed across the EU and were especially high in Southern and Eastern Europe. Let me illustrate with 3 comments left by Danish consumers on our Danish members' Facebook site in response to testing showing chemicals of concerns in food packaging. So when my colleagues found BPA in can linings, Nanya, and here in my best translation from Danish, said or posted, "Let's ban this rubbish once and for all. It's time for the politicians to wake up." Helga commented, "Why is it up to the consumer to avoid harmful chemicals in food and food packaging? Why are they not banned?" And Laila finally writes, "What's wrong with the food industry? Apparently they want to kill us all. So shocking. Little wonder that more and more people get cancer. Stop polluting our food." These statements are anecdotal only, of course, but what I hear from my colleagues in Denmark and in other European countries is that they are representative of consumers who worry about their exposure to chemicals, who don't know how best to protect their health and how to protect the health of their children, and who demand that their politicians act and that the industry acts. So, the current system of food contact materials regulation is unable to address those concerns. I think most people in the room will probably agree. But let's take a quick refresher of what we have seen over the last couple of years in terms of politics or political messaging. In 2012, the then Commission, the European Commission Department for Health and Food Safety and Consumers concluded that materials on the market are not safe, and the lack of harmonized EU measures and rules acts as a barrier to the functioning of the internal market. In 2016, and Senior already referred to this report earlier this morning, the European Parliament concluded that the lack of uniform EU measures is detrimental to public health and results in a loss of consumer trust, legal uncertainty, and increased compliance costs that are then passed on to the consumer. In 2017, we also heard there's a baseline study by the Commission's Joint Research Center which mapped the existing national measures in member states, and the studies showed that a patchwork of different national schemes for risk assessment, chemical safety, compliance documentation, and regulatory approaches. The JRC again highlights that the situation, or that in this situation, consumer safety cannot fully be achieved. Against this background, the European Commission then in November last year, finally, launched a review of the existing regulation with a kick-off event last week in Brussels, where I apologize to those in the room who were there. I was also talking and using some of the same slides and examples. So, now this review is not meant to reform the system of food contact material regulation in Europe. Instead, as the Commission and its consultants said last week, it's a backwards-looking exercise to see if the current system is fit for purpose and if it delivers as expected. I will not go into the details of exactly what the Commission is planning, the timeline and the scope of the review. I instead refer you to the link at the bottom of the slide if you're interested. But just to say that the review is now ongoing and results and possible recommendations for improving the system are expected by early 2020, after which time the Commission will then need to launch an impact assessment with a further legislative process. So we are talking the long term here. Still, from a consumer perspective, it is imperative that this review delivers credible answers to some of the issues we have heard today regarding NIA's lack of regulation for certain food contact materials, as well as combination effects of chemicals and emerging risks such as endocrine disruptors. We heard the Food Packaging Forum has a vision. I look forward to reading that vision on the flight home. We don't have a vision for how the system should be reformed. We do have some elements that we believe should be in a new system, which includes a more precautionary approach to guide risk managers in the face of scientific uncertainty and knowledge gap, so not have that act as a barrier for action, for example, against fluorinated compounds, which was our experience when we presented results to the Commission. Related to this, we would also say there needs to be a move towards a more generic risk considerations. So, for example, if you have substances that are classified as CMR under the CLP regulations, or the Classification, Labeling and Packaging Regulation of the EU, then possibly it's not a good idea to use those chemicals in a food packaging context. We already have elements of that approach in the plastic food packaging, but we would like to see it rolled out for all food contact material types. And this should then also go hand in hand with a more effective shift in the burden of proof from the regulator to the industry. We have heard interesting talks about safety by design, and we would hope that this is a program, a thinking that can be rolled out more systematically. Above all, I believe it's important to learn from those product laws we already have in place in the EU. For example, the cosmetics regulation has a Chapter 3, which sets out requirements for operators to perform safety assessments prior to placing a product on the market, as well as obligations to compile a product information files to be made available to regulators, traceability in the supply chain, and an obligation to notify products to the regulator when they're put on the market. This approach is then supplemented with the use of negative and positive lists for the most important substances from a consumer perspective, such as CMR substances, for example. Similarly, although not a proper product law, the REACH regulation also has important lessons to teach the food packaging sector, I believe. We heard both of the substances of very high concern, but REACH also establishes a duty for operators to communicate in the supply chain, which, as far as I understand, is much more far-reaching than what currently exists under the food packaging legislation. Neither REACH nor cosmetics are, of course, perfect laws, nor can they necessarily be transplanted directly to food contact. But I do believe it's important to look at these laws and other product laws in the EU to see what lessons and what principles we can learn from them. Before passing the floor to the next speaker, I wanted to say a few words around digital opportunities, or maybe rather digital potentials. The consumer right to know is a core principle of EU chemicals policy. It is established under REACH, under cosmetics, under detergents, and other chemicals laws. Still, less than half of EU citizens feel well informed about the potential dangers of chemicals in products. And our members' work aims to fill those gaps. So, to give you an example, I'm almost there. Our Danish member has, for example, created a smartphone app which helps consumers avoid cosmetics and personal care products with undesirable substances, such as suspected endocrine disruptors. So it helps the consumer navigate in the big marketplace of cosmetic products, which can be difficult to get an overview over for the normal consumer. So basically, the way the smartphone app works is that you scan the product and you are then giving a color-coded advice on whether this product potentially contains, or whether it contains substances that are of potential concern. At present, there are some 10,000 or more than 10,000 products in this database, and the app has to date been downloaded more than 280,000 times, 280,000 times, and been used for more than 6 million scans. Our French member has also developed an app which was launched earlier this year in March, which has been downloaded 700,000 times and been used more than 6 million times. Just to say, these tools cannot be implemented for food contact materials at present because we don't have the data to feed these smartphone apps. But the success of these apps shows both the appetite for information and for advice to consumers in terms of how they can protect their health better. So therefore, a better EU system for food contact materials needs to improve the transparency and availability of data to allow such digital tools to be implemented. We believe the benefits both for safety and for consumer confidence in food packaging products speaks for themselves. And with that, thank you.